Now, we know from fossils and from clever investigation of dinosaur fossils that their center of balance for many of these dinosaurs was around the hips. And so they had large tails, large muscles that connected from the tail to bones within the hips near the hind legs. And they also had large muscles going forward that connected to the rest of the body in front of the legs. And in many cases, these dinosaurs had the hip, the rear hip, was the highest part of their body. For example, certain sauropod dinosaurs had tall hips. They may have been able to stand on those hips. Well, what are the other candidates? The other candidates for behemoth, if you have to restrict yourself to looking at just animals that are in the zoo, and then if you take the cues that are given in some of these study Bible notes or even translation notes, then the other candidates would include elephant or hippopotamus. And certainly they do have strong hips. But with this creature, his power is in his stomach muscles. And here's the key. It says that he moves his tail like a cedar. Now, I've been to the zoo. I've seen elephants, and I've seen the little elephant tail, and it doesn't remind me of a cedar tree or any other kind of tree. And I've been to the zoo, and I've looked at hippopotami, and I've seen their little flap-like tail, and it doesn't remind me of a tree in any way. Not its shape, not its size, certainly not the way it moves. But when I look at dinosaur fossils, and I see reconstructions, for example, of some of these sauropod dinosaurs, these are the ones with the long, 30-foot long in some cases neck, 30-foot long tail, 100 feet long total, just enormous. These were the largest creatures that God ever made and placed on this planet. And here it does say in Job chapter 40 that he is the chief of the ways of God. Behemoth is the chief. What else can we say about that but that it must mean he's the biggest land creature God ever made? And God's making this point to Job. He's saying, look, you can't approach this ginormous creature, and as big as this creature is, the creature's creator, me, must be much bigger. And so if the point is for God to say, look, I'm the big man around here. You can trust me. And you can know that I'm the big man because I am the creature's creator. The creature's large. I must be that much larger in power and in scope. So he was the largest. We also read in Job that he lies in a covert of reeds and marsh. The willows by the brook surround him. So he's by the brook. He's in a river, or he's in a river bank, and he's in a marsh or swampy setting. Interestingly, we do know from fossils that sauropod and other dinosaurs were buried alongside swamp animals like turtles and birds, and swamp birds like ducks and even some geese look like just like today's ducks and geese, and even a fossil parrot, tropical birds, swamp birds, and frogs, fish are buried right alongside with dinosaur fossils. This also fits. So the habitat described in Job of a creature that lived in a swampy environment, a creature with a large tail, a tail that reminds God, at least, who's giving this narrative to Job, of a tree, this fits best, I think, with a dinosaur, and probably a sauropod dinosaur described right here in the Bible in Job, alive after the flood, but probably extinct today.
Thank you for joining us on Science, Scripture, and Salvation, a radio ministry of the Institute for Creation Research. That's all the time we have for our program today, but we would love to connect with you through our website at icr.org. For over 45 years, ICR has equipped believers with evidence of the Bible's accuracy and authority by showing how science supports the Genesis creation account. Our scientists research the evidence for creation and communicate their findings through books, articles, DVD series, and conferences. Please visit our website at icr.org for more information about the latest scientific discoveries, to subscribe to our free magazine and devotional, and to locate our next creation conference at a venue near you. All of this and more at icr.org. From sharks to butterflies, bats to orangutans, we can't help but marvel at the stunning and amusing creatures God has made. If you and your kids enjoy learning about animals, then you'll love our book, Guide to Animals, with its beautiful, full-color images and fascinating facts. Published by the Institute for Creation Research, Guide to Animals provides answers to many popular questions about the animal kingdom. How do chameleons change colors? How do jellyfish live without a brain? And what happened to the dinosaurs and other extinct animals? Guide to Animals shows how everything that can slither, crawl, soar, or swim displays the handiwork of God. Order your copy of Guide to Animals from the Institute for Creation Research by calling 800-628-7640 or visiting ICR.org. That's 800-628-7640 or visiting ICR.org.
From the editor's desk, Rob Pugh from Wisconsin Christian News.
When notable major events take place and the mainstream media immediately jumps on those news stories, I typically don't respond immediately. I've learned to wait, to do research, gather information, and then do my best to separate the hype from the deliberate lies. But I've watched the situation in Minnesota unfold for many weeks now, and the time has come to speak, because there certainly seems to be a lot being exposed there all at once now. When situations like this develop, I have to wonder why we're being allowed to see this and why now. The current situation in Minnesota began with Operation Metro Surge, starting in December as the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, launched a concentrated deployment of agents there, mainly in the Twin Cities, focusing on an enormous population of illegal immigrants, mostly Somalians, estimated now at least 100,000 people. But then, at the end of December, allegations of massive fraud emerged, involving over $100 million federal dollars being sent to fund Somali-run child care centers. On December 31st, the Trump administration launched an investigation into the situation. Initial findings show more than $9 billion of fraud in more than a dozen Medicaid-funded programs in Minnesota, again centered around Somali-run child care centers and other organizations. Citizen reporters have tracked down some of these daycare centers and found several buildings that appear to have been abandoned some time ago, some with blacked-out windows in neighborhoods that were not child-friendly, and one that was vacant on a previous weekday now suddenly had about 50 children inside. At least one facility that is in operation has had a child die there and other children injured in previous months. But this isn't Minnesota's first rodeo. I should mention the Feeding Our Future scandal. Feeding Our Future was a Minnesota nonprofit originally set up during COVID to help provide meals to children. But federal prosecutors determined that instead of feeding kids, the organization and a giant web of associates fraudulently stole hundreds of millions of dollars. Here's how it worked. They signed up hundreds of supposed meal sites across Minnesota. Then they submitted fake documentation, including meal counts, attendance records, and invoices, claiming to serve meals that were never actually provided. They received reimbursements from the Federal Child Nutrition Program based on those false records, and used the stolen funds for personal enrichment, including luxury vehicles, real estate, and travel. According to federal sources, Feeding Our Future and its co-conspirators fraudulently obtained more than $240 million in program funds between 2020 and 22. Hundreds of fraudulent sites were identified, and by last year, at least 78 people had been indicted or charged. Of those 78, 72 were Somali nationals, and 57 of those have already been convicted. So the powers that be have known about the fraud and theft of public monies for years, but only now is the mainstream media letting the cat out of the bag. Interestingly, it comes as Trump has launched Operation Metro Surge in the Twin Cities, as ICE and other federal agents attempt to round up illegals there, which has brought us to where we are now, on the brink of civil war. Leftist Americans are siding with their Islamic neighbors, labeling ICE agents as Gestapo and fighting law enforcement in a highly organized way. More on that shortly, but we shouldn't forget the recent reports from Homeland Security officials revealing TSA screenings at the Minneapolis airport have flagged huge amounts of cash being flown out of the country in the last 2 years. We're talking a minimum of $342 million that we know of in 2024, $349 million in 2025. This cash was carried by Somali couriers and flown on routes to Amsterdam and then Dubai. Some individual pieces of luggage contained as much as $1 million in cash. This money has been funding al-Shabaab, known for suicide bombings, assassinations, improvised explosive devices, and attacks on government forces. They've sworn allegiance to al-Qaeda since 2012. There's also the Islamic State in Somalia, which is linked directly to ISIS. Your tax dollars at work, folks, stolen through fraud and likely orchestrated by government traders working for the people of the state of Minnesota. Somalians began arriving in Minnesota in 1991. The Minneapolis-St. Paul metro area now has the largest Somali population in the U.S., and they have not come to America to become Americans. As the internet will tell you in the politically correct manner that it does, they live in ethnic enclaves. That means no-go zones to you and me. Some will call their political involvement assimilation, but infiltration would be a more accurate description. Minnesota boasts the notorious Ilhan Omar, the first Somalian woman placed in the U.S. Congress. But Muslims also hold other high political offices in Minnesota, including Keith Ellison, the state attorney general, Nadia Mohammed, mayor of St. Louis Park, also from Somalia, Omar Fatah, a Minnesota state senator, also from Somalia, Zainab Mohammed, another state senator and also from Somalia. And then there's Mohammed Noor, a state representative and another Somalian, and Abdi Warsame, a former Minneapolis City Council member and also a Somalian. Now, the internet will tell you that Minnesota has such a strong Islamic presence in local, state, and federal politics because of their enormous Somali population, which has helped create voting blocs and community organization. But Muslims have been engaging in migration jihad for decades now. We've witnessed what's happened to Western European countries where Muslims overwhelm the infrastructure, then establish their own communities, then take over political power. We've warned of this for decades, yet very few have taken this seriously. Surely that could never happen in America, surely never in a place like Minnesota. Well, I hate to say I told you so, but yes, there are some Somalians and other Muslims that hold jobs and support themselves honestly, but most do not. Now, that's not rhetoric or Islamophobia. The numbers tell the story. Instead of working, the Center for Immigration Studies reports that 89% of Somali immigrant households with children use some welfare, with 86% on Medicaid. That's versus 28% for native-born Americans. 81% of Somali households are on welfare overall. 80% remain on welfare even after 10 years or more living in the U.S. And 54% rely on food stamps. Only 7% of native-born Americans do. I wouldn't call that assimilation. It's called working the system, and they're very good at it. So that's a lot of information about Islam and Somalians in Minnesota. Now I'll ask again, why are we getting so much news about all this now? Our political leaders have known about all this forever, but now they and their cohorts in the mainstream media have released this damning information to the public. At the same time, ICE mounts a major operation in the Minnesota Somali community, sparking outrage among the leftist rioters there. I believe it's another attempt to divide Americans and bring chaos and perhaps even civil war as Americans attack other Americans. Tensions in Minnesota have continued to rise. The opposition to ICE, as in other American cities, has been fierce and well coordinated. The fingerprints of George Soros are all over this. In fact, we know that his Open Society Foundation has provided millions in grants to groups like the Sunrise Movement, now openly supporting resistance against ICE activities. Why is Soros still not in prison? You may be surprised to know that other nonprofits like the Ford Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation also support the Sunrise Movement. Local activist groups in Minnesota also receive funding through broader nonprofit channels. And just as they also help facilitate the invasion of our borders by illegals, professing Christian organizations are also heavily involved. We know of Catholic Charities, the ELCA Lutheran Churches, the Presbyterian Church USA, the United Methodist Church, and many others. So-called churches that will not support or preach the commands of God Almighty, but are proud to hang a rainbow flag on their building, endorse sodomy, baby murder, and interfaith dialogue with worshipers of a false god. These groups are also helping to organize and train people to assault and attack law enforcement while protecting the enemy within. These groups attract an inordinate number of purple-haired warriors. That's a term coined by David T. Kloft in a brilliant article he wrote for the American Free News Network. I need to quote from this because it's so spot on. He writes, "There she is again, small, loud, highly visible, and absolutely convinced she's saving the planet by screaming at strangers in public while someone films it for Instagram. You've seen her, big glasses, septum ring, hair the color of a microwave grape popsicle. A face that says, 'I'm here to save humanity,' paired with the emotional regulation of a toddler who missed nap time and found the cookie jar anyway. And she is not simply protesting, she's crusading. She's not arguing policy, she's delivering judgment. Modern activism isn't just politics anymore. It's religion, except the God is ideology. The scripture is whatever the trend says this week, and the holiness comes from being angry in public." Here's the part people miss. The purple-haired warrior doesn't show up because she's carefully studied immigration law, enforcement authority, economics, and the Constitution, then calmly concluded that blocking vans in traffic is the best way to improve life for everyone. No, she shows up because she has an ache, a low-grade emptiness, a craving for purpose. And in a society that has hollowed out family, faith, and local community, that ache gets answered in the cheapest, easiest, and most intoxicating way imaginable. Join a movement, declare yourself righteous, and pick an enemy. I really wish I had time to share that whole article with you because it's excellent and describes the far left, often homosexual and lesbian crusaders fighting back against the man, the perceived enemy, who in reality is simply enforcing the laws that our once civilized society agreed were reasonable and necessary to maintain order and a semblance of justice. Recently, I read an article published locally that describes how these ICE protesters operate. It was written to make them out to be heroes of freedom and civil rights. This article describes how these anti-ICE people are organized, how they network using encrypted messaging apps and social media, how they patrol areas of Minneapolis looking for ICE agents to taunt so they can impede their work, and then call on hundreds of other activists just waiting for the alert on their phones or the sound of whistles blowing so they can assemble and mount the attack. The newspaper that published this article should be ashamed for framing such deluded criminal conspirators as heroes. Lawlessness abounds, and like other American cities and states, Islam has now conquered Minnesota. I never thought I'd see the day, but here we are. And the useful idiot protesting pawns on the left are dutifully kissing their feet. Deuteronomy 28 tells us what happens to a nation that refuses to obey Almighty God. Among the curses the nation will receive, we have this in verse 43. The foreign resident among you shall rise higher and higher above you, and you shall come down lower and lower. All the wisdom of God is right there in his book for our benefit. Are you going to dust off your copy yet? Wake up, people, because America has fallen.
This editorial was provided by Wisconsin Christian News. Views expressed are those of the speaker. For more information, call 715-486-8066 or visit wisconsinchristiannews.com. This is VCY America, WVCY FM Milwaukee, Christian Information Radio.
Teens today are constantly bombarded with cultural messages that say their identity is based on the world's values. Believing that drops a person into a never-ending pit of despair. Young people especially need to learn about the identity God has instilled in them through Christ. The VCY Bookstore and Outreach Center is offering a book titled 50 Days to Embracing and Enjoying Who God Says You Are, authored by Pastor Eric and his teenage daughter, Eden. Each day you will hear from both of them as you take this journey of finding out what Scripture says about those who have trusted Christ as their Savior. This book is for teens, but you will benefit greatly no matter what age you are. 50 Days to Embracing and Enjoying Who God Says You Are is 48% off at the VCY Bookstore and Outreach Center for the month of January. Visit us at 10707 West Capitol Drive in Milwaukee. Call us at 414-463-1770 or check out our website at vcy.com.
NAPRA technology is really a way of assessing and treating those root cause issues by first understanding what's actually happening on a hormonal level with a woman's cycle.
Welcome to Straight Talk on Life Issues. I'm Victor Nieves, president of Life Issues Institute. Today we're going to be talking about a very interesting topic that is naprotechnology, also known as natural procreative technology. It's a women's health science that monitors and maintains a woman's reproductive and gynecological health. It provides medical and surgical treatments that cooperate completely with the reproductive system and honor the sanctity of human life. Today we have Dr. Gavin Putoff to talk to us more about it. Dr. Gavin is the founder and medical director of Veritas Fertility and Surgery. He's a board-certified gynecologist specializing in the treatment of infertility, endometriosis, miscarriage, and other gynecological conditions. He's trained in surgical naprotechnology, a form of advanced reproductive surgery. Well, Dr. Putoff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. This is a great opportunity.
So for our listener out there who may not be familiar with naprotechnology, it's very exciting. I don't want to try and explain it to them. You're the man to give the explanation. Tell us about what naprotech really is.
So naprotechnology is a way of seeing women's health and fertility that was developed by Dr. Thomas Hilgers back in the late 70s, early 80s. And interestingly, it actually started as charting with what's called the Creighton Model Fertility Care System. And when women are trained and sort of educated on how best to chart their cycles, the Creighton Model System is a very standardized method of tracking various biomarkers during the cycle, their bleeding patterns, their cervical mucus pattern. And so what Dr. Hilgers sort of accidentally found out was when we're actually monitoring the cycle with that level of specificity, you start to pick up all the abnormal aspects that can show up in a woman's chart. I always will tell our patients that their Creighton model chart actually becomes the diagnostic foundation for everything that we do with our restorative reproductive medicine approach to gynecologic health and fertility. So naprotechnology is really a way of assessing and treating those root cause issues by first understanding what's actually happening on a hormonal level with a woman's cycle.
And so in layman's terms, this is about fertility. This is about fixing the underlying issues that might be preventing a woman from conceiving a child.
Correct, right. So it's both gynecologic health and fertility or infertility. And we say fertility in both ways, right? So we want obviously to support the fertility of a couple. And sometimes couples will choose at various times of their life to say, we're going to observe our fertility, understand our fertility for health purposes, but also maybe to space children. Of course, in our practice, our focus really is assessing and treating those underlying issues of infertility that are causing infertility. And I think that's a big difference with naprotechnology as well, is that naprotechnology, the way we see infertility is it's not a disease. It is the symptom of other underlying conditions that cause the infertility. So oftentimes we hear, infertility is this condition, it's this disease, it just has to be treated with IVF or artificial insemination. And that's sort of like a back out approach. It really is, it doesn't force you to look for those other underlying issues. So with naprotechnology, just even simply our verbiage and understanding of infertility as the symptom of those underlying conditions, it kind of compels us then to be more investigative and to look at those deeper underlying problems that we can address, both to help improve the woman's health, but also to improve fertility. So a big focus of what we do is we want to assess in a very comprehensive way what each individual woman or each individual couple's issues might be so that we can offer them those very specific and targeted treatments.
And so is NAPRO technology relatively new? I only ask because it seems for so long IVF to so many has kind of been the default. If there's a fertility issue, people just naturally assume that that's what they have to do. Is this a little bit newer, or why might it be that more people aren't aware of NAPRO technology and treating this as the go-to?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it is not new. Like I said, Dr. Hildreth developed NAPRO technology in the 80s and then actually published a textbook in the early 2000s called Medical and Surgical NAPRO Technology. We call it the Big Black Book because it's huge. And Dr. Hildreth, in the process of developing NAPRO, really understood that there was a huge void. And a big part of his impetus to develop this was out of Humanae Vitae with Pope Paul VI, or St. Pope Paul VI now, calling on men and women of science to better understand the cycle and to better understand fertility. And so that was, a call that Dr. Hildreth felt strongly to pursue. And in so doing, he developed NAPRO technology. Now, obviously, in the 80s and the early 90s, we had very limited access to broadcasting and websites, but Dr. Hildreth would do interviews and he would, obviously train other physicians to understand what NAPRO technology is. So it grew as sort of a very organic, in some ways, process where doctors who wanted to offer something else other than, well, I just don't do birth control pills, or I'm a Catholic doctor, so I don't do X, Y, or Z. But here's actually the proactive stance that we can take from a Catholic perspective to better treat our couples with dignity and understanding of their underlying, their worth and the dignity of marriage. So I think it's definitely been growing, of course. And really in the last several years, we've seen it take hold in a much different way, I believe, because of this sort of move in our culture toward let's try to be healthier. Let's try to understand what those root issues are. Restorative reproductive medicine, I think, is becoming more prominent and more understood as this is a more appropriate, or this is more healthy way to address gynecologic concerns and to address infertility. And I would say that that's one of the main complaints that we hear is, why did I not hear about this 10 years ago, when I was going through these issues? And IVF truly as an industry has so much financial backing, and there's so much that's poured into the pharmaceutical industry and the what we call big fertility industry that it is hard to keep up, and it's hard to sort of get our voice out there. But I think as more and more couples and women are learning about what we offer with NAPRO technology and restorative reproductive medicine, it's going to continue to spread as it has been. So to answer the question again, it is not new, but it's just, I think, becoming more newly understood on the more broad scale, which I think is fantastic for patients.
It does seem, in my anecdotal experience, that there is definitely a rise in people who are, especially younger people who are in that health-minded space, who are now talking about this as an option. Let's talk about the big question, the elephant in the room that people are probably wondering. How's the success rate? Is this working well for people? Are they happy with it? And then, we know, we'll get into this, I suppose, we know IVF is notoriously quite expensive. So for somebody who might be thinking about this, what can you tell us about that?
So in terms of a success rate, it's always difficult to say exactly what it is for any particular condition. We are currently finishing out a 10-year database of my patients since I've been in practice for over 10 years to actually be able to give that answer of, if you have stage 2 endometriosis and a blocked fallopian tube, this is what we would expect as your success rate. But in general, what we will see is somewhere between 60 to 80% success rates in terms of overall chances of achieving a pregnancy. And that's fantastic. I mean, that is very, very good in terms of the outcome for our patients. So many of our patients are coming to us after 3, 4, 5, 8 years of infertility, and we're still seeing those types of success rates in the 60 to 80% range. IVF success rates are measured slightly differently. They're generally measured on a cycle-to-cycle basis. And in general, most of the cycles will have about a 30% success rate. It really depends a lot on certain factors like the woman's age. And as you get into your early 40s, those success rates drop down to 20 or even less than that per cycle. So cumulatively, IVF success, if one could afford and tolerate the psychological stress and emotional stress of going through multiple cycles of IVF, the cumulative success rate for IVF generally settles out right about 60%. So we're still seeing success rates truly that are better than that. Now, it's not that you'll get pregnant next month necessarily with NAPRO technology, because we're actually treating those underlying conditions, and that's going to take some time, and that's going to take a process of understanding what's going on with the cycle and what's going on with fertility. But here's the other really important thing I think to note, which is very different from IVF, is with NAPRO technology, because we're treating chronic disease states or chronic issues, issues, we are not just achieving a pregnancy once, but actually allowing for couples to have ongoing recurring fertility, quite to the point of we actually have patients who will come back and they'll see us after pregnancy and say, well, I had X, Y, or Z condition prior to, I had to get that treated. Do I have to do anything different for number two? And oftentimes it's very little intervention that's needed for that second or third or fourth child. Or we even won't even have the patient come back and they'll just be sending us their Christmas card and we'll see that they've got 4 kids on those Christmas cards now when we had only treated them before their first child. So that's really the goal is with NAPRO technology, if we can treat those other underlying issues, that we're allowing for ongoing fertility compared to IVF, which was, going to have to be used every single time that you'd want to get pregnant.
Talk about an incredible blessing. And, just as a complete layman in this, Dr. Putoff, it would seem, logically speaking, that when you look at IVF, if there are these underlying issues that could be chronic illness, a couple of things that you've described, if IVF is not addressing those issues, that seems in a way like putting a Band-Aid over a bullet hole. That doesn't seem to be actually helping the woman. That seems to be one of the most compelling parts of NAPRO technology is it's getting, my understanding here from what you're saying, is it's getting to the actual root of the issue.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely one of the things that we hear from couples who've been through the IVF process is not only is it expensive and sort of burdensome from an emotional and psychological standpoint, oftentimes when women will go through the IVF process, whether they achieve a pregnancy or not, they get this gut sense that they don't actually care about my health. I tried to bring up my symptoms. I tried to bring up this other issue. And the response almost invariably is, it doesn't matter why you aren't able to get pregnant because we have this thing called IVF. And we can just circumvent those issues. And what does that mean to a patient who's going in to have everybody wants to know the why. They want to understand why can we not achieve a pregnancy as a couple? What's going on here? And for the answer to be, it doesn't matter. We're just going to circumvent this problem completely. That's not why we go to physicians. We want to go to the doctor to become pregnant, sure, but we also want to become healthier, more knowledgeable about our health and to help to support our health. And you do not get that through the IVF process, unfortunately, because exactly what you said, now we're allowing pregnancies to occur potentially in a state of an underlying inflammatory state, hormone deficient state, chronic diseases like issues with the uterus or the fallopian tubes or the pelvic tissues like endometriosis. That's not going to be as healthy of a pregnancy. And that's actually shown in the data that IVF pregnancies are not as healthy as pregnancies that occurred spontaneously.
And that's not an issue then with NAPRO technology.
Right, because we're always helping to support the natural fertility of our couples. We want to be able to fix those issues, optimize their overall health, and thereby now they're achieving a pregnancy in a state of health. We always say healthy mom, healthy pregnancy, healthy baby. That's the goal of what we want. And who wouldn't want that? And that's the issue is that a lot of couples just don't even know that's an option. They just assume, okay, if I'm not getting pregnant with my OBGYN, doing a couple cycles of Clomid, for example, I'm going to be whisked off to the IVF clinic. And guess what? They're going to recommend is after a couple of cycles of IUI or artificial insemination, it's off to IVF. And that's basically the one size fits all approach to that method of treating infertility. And I think that's a big part of it also is that the treatments that we offer with NAPRO technology, they're complicated. They involve a lot more investigation from our perspective. They involve more buy-in from our patients. We actually ask our patients to participate in this process in a very different way. We're not subjecting them to treatment after treatment or cycle after cycle of IVF, for example. I think that's also a positive because our patients now feel engaged in their care. I mean, you would not believe the types of questions, very, very educated, questions that we get from our patients about little nuances. Because once they start to get into this, it starts to open up all these other different aspects of, well, what about my nutrition? What about my health? What about inflammatory issues or stressors in my life? What else can I do to take this to the next level of encouraging, improved health and fertility?
And what are some of those areas where you see women regularly have not just improved fertility? Obviously, that's kind of the whole point here, but also their health at large, because these underlying health issues, those need to be addressed as well. What are some of those areas that you've seen people's lives change in their overall health and wellness?
Yeah, I mean, obviously that is the goal, right? Well, obviously the end goal for a lot of our patients who are seeking us out for care, they're trying to achieve a pregnancy, yes, but they also want to become healthier. So, I was talking about the Creighton model charting earlier. On the Creighton chart, we can pick up so many issues, whether it's bleeding abnormalities or heavy cycles or limited cervical mucus or abnormal spotting before the cycle starts, just based on that. when we start to run timed blood tests and timed ultrasounds that are specifically targeting their cycle, because not everybody ovulates on day 14, not everybody has a 28-day cycle. We start to pick up very important but subtle aspects of ovulations not happening correctly. We're just forming a cyst every month, or the hormone levels after an ovulation are deficient. Let's help to support that. So it's pretty fascinating actually to watch our patients. This is kind of routine to us, right? But to watch our patients say, wait a second, you know all of those things about my cycle just because I charted for a month or two. And it's outstanding because obviously then we can help to support their own fertility, their natural fertility cycle. So that's sort of on the most basic level. When we start to talk about more complicated conditions or more inflammatory conditions, we think of things like uterine issues like fibroids or scar tissue in the uterus, inflammation inside the uterine lining called chronic endometritis, something that many couples who have infertility will suffer with and struggle with. Things like endometriosis, pelvic scar tissue, polycystic ovaries, adenomyosis. When you take those next steps to identify and treat those other underlying issues, you start to find out that, wow, this particular patient, this particular couple has so many things that we can help to optimize for them. For our patients, for example, who have endometriosis, when we treat endometriosis, and truly it is a surgically treated condition in most cases, right? So we offer this laparoscopic surgery or robotic surgery to address endometriosis. The way that we treat it is to actually excise all of those implants of disease. So endometriosis, I guess I should step back and say, is a condition where the cells that should have just stayed inside the uterine lining are now in the pelvic tissues. And they create a lot of inflammation and they can cause a significant amount of pain in addition to infertility. Well, so we're treating it, yes, for infertility, but also guess what? Our patients don't have heavier, painful cycles usually after surgery. Almost all of our patients will notice a substantial change, a substantial improvement in the amount of cramping or pain or heaviness of their cycle. And they're so excited to finally feel like, wow, somebody actually cared enough to take care of this condition in a way that provides me a long-term relief of this pain that I just thought I was going to have to suffer with every single cycle for the rest of my life.
And in a way that, as I understand it, if they would have just been ushered to IVF, they'd still be dealing with these issues. We love a good story. And as we hear this, I can imagine over the years of having done this, you have no doubt accumulated many wonderful stories of families that have just got these incredible testimonials. When you think about your work and helping women and families, what are some of those that stand out to you?
I think there's two. I think one is, when we have patients who come in to see us who have been told by other clinics, IVF clinics, this is not going to happen without IVF. You have to do IVF. You're never going to get pregnant on your own. It's almost like it's thrown onto the patient like they have something to prove. They want to show that the IVF clinic, you know what, I don't think that's right. I actually am going to go seek out a second opinion. And so I think the ones that stand out for sure are those patients who've been through the other process with IVF clinics, haven't gotten answers, haven't gotten the issues addressed, and they've basically been told, your ovaries are done, you've got to do donor egg IVF, that's the only way you're ever going to get pregnant. And then we offer them this restorative approach to their fertility where we treat those other underlying issues. Just within the last few weeks, we've had a patient who had 8.5 years of infertility, who now is pregnant just 2 months after her surgery. So when we actually treat those issues, wow, that's amazing what the body can actually do on its own once you address these other underlying issues. So that's one. I certainly think that those who have been through the other process with IVF clinics, who felt very defeated, who felt like the approach didn't address their why, the why that they had in their hearts about why can we not achieve a pregnancy, and then they come over to this side of things and see a completely different approach. It's very, very refreshing, I think. The other one is couples who've had multiple miscarriages and multiple loss. And I think this is very difficult and challenging in a very different way from infertility because they're getting pregnant, but they're so guarded at that point after they've had 2, 3, 4, 5 losses. And those are very complicated scenarios because there's often many times multiple conditions that can cause miscarriages. And it's a very thorough and deep investigation to understand what those issues are. And our approaches are different than a standard IVF approach, which again would just say, well, we're just going to try to do IVF and hopefully it works out this time. So I can recall multiple patients who've had something as simple as a uterine septum. It's an abnormality that's developed in the uterus. It occurred from birth. The uterus just didn't form correctly, but it comes with a very, very high risk of having miscarriages. And the treatment is straightforward. And after we take out the septum surgically, these patients can go on and have healthy pregnancies. And it's such a straightforward treatment in our eyes that why would every couple not be given this opportunity to address these issues? So no, it's amazing. I mean, obviously, we really do truly feel blessed to be able to do the work that we do every day. It's hard work, but it's totally worth it when we get those calls from patients who tell us, hey, I'm pregnant and I never thought that this was going to be happening for us.
So for maybe the listener out there who's wondering, is this something that I should be pursuing? At what point in your professional opinion, would you say it's time for a couple to start thinking about this as an option?
Well, it's never too early to start charting the cycle. And we always encourage couples to start charting even in advance of thinking that they might have a problem, like we're not getting pregnant or I have really heavy or abnormal cycles. The more you can chart your cycle, the more you learn about the cycle and the more quickly you can identify those issues that might be arising early on. So we always encourage couples to chart. There's various charting methods. Obviously, with NAPRO technology, we prefer or really work well with the Creighton Model Fertility Care System. And there are practitioners across the country, actually across the world, who are trained in helping couples understand how to chart their cycle. So fertility care, for example, is somewhere where a woman could go to this website and find a practitioner in her area who could help her start to chart the cycle. So that's step one. Step two is obviously, if you have symptoms, whether that's we're not able to conceive after 6 to 12 months, or we're having really heavy cycles, or I'm in a lot of pain during periods or other times of the cycle, let those symptoms not just be sort of pushed off to the side or ignored, and know that you deserve answers and you can get those answers. So especially when symptoms start to arise, whether that symptom is infertility or the symptom is an abnormal cycle or abnormal pain, or heavy cycles, that's a good time to start, the evaluation. I think so oftentimes women are pretty tough and they'll tolerate a lot. I think if guys had cycles, we would wuss out and be looking for that painkiller or that doctor who's going to help us figure out things sooner. But, we hear couples or we hear women who've had 10 years of severe debilitating pain, and they might have gone to a couple of the doctors who said, "Oh, just go on the birth control pill. This is normal." That is not normal. A normal cycle should not be painful. Let me say that again because it's so important. I think so many women think it's normal to have severe cramps during periods. No, that is not normal. That's an evidence of some issue that's going on with the cycle. So that would be what I'd say is if as soon as you start having symptoms, to reach out and obviously to find somebody who cares enough to not just throw the birth control pill at you.
Dr. Putoff, do you have many patients that come to you because they would prefer to do things in a more natural, holistic way, but also in a way that honors the sanctity of life? Is there a moral and ethical concern that you're seeing as it pertains to IVF that would lead people toward NAPRO technology?
Yeah, certainly we see both. We see those patients who see us because they've been through IVF and they never want to do it again because it's so burdensome financially or psychologically, emotionally, physically. And so they're maybe coming at this from a non-religious perspective. They want a different approach. They want a more natural approach. Then you certainly have that contingent of women or couples who say, we don't want to put anything artificial in our body. We're trying to live a healthy life in all aspects of our life. And the same would go for their fertility care. Again, not necessarily a moral imperative or religious conviction to not pursue IVF, but just because they want something that's natural and that's going to be supportive of their overall natural approach to their life. And then certainly we have couples who come to us specifically because they do, as the church sees this, they do understand life begins at conception. And they would never want to pursue a treatment that would take that and circumvent that issue or even denigrate that issue. With IVF, multiple embryos have to be created for one to be able to survive and to implant. There's different estimates. Somewhere around 90% of embryos that are created are never born. And that obviously is hugely problematic. When we think about each embryo that's created, that's a new life. And that life is now a commodity in a fertility clinic to be basically sold to the parents. And so, we have a lot of patients who they know that, they see that, and they want an approach that honors the dignity of life from the very moment of conception and honors the process that God created for fertility, for natural conception, the dignity of marriage.
Dr. Putoff, I've heard on occasion people will describe your practice as a quote unquote alternative to IVF. I wish people would stop saying that because this seems to be what it ought to be. This is what should be, where it's natural, it's honoring the sanctity of life, it is truly healing to the woman who's involved rather than IVF. So to someone who is looking to be pregnant, if you had one piece of advice for that woman, what would it be?
That's a great question. Obviously here I am as a physician thinking about all those different issues or conditions that we see most commonly. But I think that the most basic is to understand the cycle and to understand what the biomarkers of the cycle, like cervical mucus or bleeding patterns, what they mean for fertility. Because actually studies have shown that couples who chart their cycle will achieve pregnancy more quickly and with a higher degree of success than those who don't. So it's such a straightforward first step that I would be remiss to not say, chart your cycle, understand your fertility, and that becomes a very powerful stepping stone if there is an issue to be able to move on to the diagnosis and treatment. So yeah, I would say that from the very get-go is understand the cycle, understand fertility. The window of fertility lasts about 4 to 5 days in the context of good cervical mucus. So for example, if we have a patient who has just 1 day or half a day of quality, clear, stretchy, egg white type of cervical mucus, that's their fertile window. It's a very, very narrow window where it should be 4 or 5 days. So that's why the charting is so important for couples who are hoping to conceive.
Well, Dr. Puthoff, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a very interesting and eye-opening program for myself and for certainly all of our listeners.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
Today's program has been eye-opening for me, and I'm sure it has been for you as well. You know, there's so many couples out there who unfortunately are struggling with the issues of infertility, and oftentimes they're ushered toward IVF as if it is the only option, ignoring, for one, the financial cost of it, but for two, and more importantly, the moral and ethical concerns about the way that IVF is handled, to know that there is a better way, not necessarily an alternative, but a better way to address health and fertility, and hopefully to allow some of these families to have those children. We know that children are a tremendous blessing, and to hear that NAPRO technology honors the sanctity of all human life while also giving that chance to couples is such a blessing. If you want to learn more about it, visit our website, lifeissues.org, and be sure to tune in next week for another Straight Talk on Life Issues.
SRN News, I'm Mary Rose. About 240 million people are under cold weather advisories and winter storm warnings as a powerful system threatens to bring howling winds, flooding, and heavy snow to the East Coast. National Weather Service forecaster Bob Orvarek has the story.
It's another cold day across, especially the eastern part of the United States. We have a lot of cold temperatures, anywhere from the plains eastward to the East Coast. The lowest temperature this morning actually was in West Virginia at minus 27, but there was a lot of minus teens and minus 20s from Minnesota down into parts of Wisconsin and into Iowa.
IndyCar will be coming to the streets of the nation's capital this summer.
President Trump signed an executive order establishing the August 23rd IndyCar race in downtown Washington, D.C. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy told the president the nation's capital has never seen anything like this before.
To think 190 miles an hour down Pennsylvania Avenue, this is going to be wild.
The race is designed to be part of America's 250th birthday celebrations. Greg Clugston, Washington.
It's that time of the year when people sign up for health care coverage. Economist Steve Moore says those on Obamacare are in for some sticker shock.
Obamacare plans have actually dramatically increased costs. Remember when Barack Obama said that this would, drive down costs and it would be the Affordable Care Act? We're finding that the price for plans now have doubled to tripled in just 15 years.
Moore made his comments to the Salem Radio Network. The U.S. Coast Guard has announced that the search for survivors on a commercial fishing vessel that sank off the coast of Massachusetts with 7 aboard has been suspended. The Coast Guard launched a search and rescue mission early Friday. This is SRN News. Religion retreats in Europe.
According to a wide-ranging survey by the Pew Research Center, a lot of people on the continent are abandoning faith. In 2010, 74% of Europeans called themselves Christians. Now only 67% do. Over the same period, the number of people who identify as Jews dropped nearly 10%. Pew says the group that's really growing is the unaffiliated. The share of atheists, agnostics, and people of no particular religion is up 37%. Michael Harrington reporting.
The Trump administration is expanding its ban on foreign aid to include assistance going to international and domestic organizations that promote transgenderism, as well as diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. An administration official says the State Department has established rules that expand the scope of the Mexico City policy, which bars U.S. taxpayer dollars from promoting abortion abroad. This is SRN News. The SAVE Act, or Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, is a proposed law that would require U.S. citizens to provide documentary proof of citizenship, such as a birth certificate or a passport, when registering to vote. Pennsylvania Senator Dave McCormick believes Congress will pass the measure.
I think there's a growing support among Republicans to make sure we get this done, and the support we get it done this year. And I think that momentum is going to be hard to overcome.
U.S. travelers without a real ID or valid identification will face a new $45 non-refundable TSA fee starting Sunday, tomorrow. The Confirm ID screening can take up to 30 minutes and doesn't guarantee passengers will make their flight. More details at srnnews.com.
In John chapter 4, verse 35, our Lord says, "Say not ye, there are yet 4 months, and then cometh harvest? Behold, I say unto you, lift up your eyes, and look on the fields, for they are white already to harvest." God's Word, the Bible, concerning the urgency of the hour. John 4:35.
Did you know VCY America is available